Welcome to the Daily Globe. Please subscribe and hit the bell icon for more breaking updates. In the crisp autumn of 2025, a sudden and dramatic trade crisis erupted, sending shockwaves through the economies of North America and reverberating across the globe. What began as a dispute over steel quickly escalated into a full-blown trade war, with both the United States and Canada digging in their heels, determined to defend their industries and national interests. The world watched as border tensions rose, ports slowed to a crawl, and news outlets scrambled to keep up with the rapidly unfolding events. The crisis didn't just shake North America, it sent ripples through financial markets and boardrooms worldwide, raising urgent questions about the future of international cooperation. At the heart of the conflict was steel, a vital material for countless industries. The US and Canada, long-standing allies and trading partners, suddenly found themselves at odds. Detroit's automotive industry, which relies heavily on Canadian steel, faced uncertainty and potential layoffs, while Canada's economic identity, deeply tied to its resource sector, was put to the test. But this dispute was about more than just tariffs and trade balances. It became a test of international alliances, exposing the fragility of relationships built over decades. As nationalism surged and political leaders took hardline stances, the world wondered if the era of global cooperation was coming to an end. The crisis called into question the resilience of global trade networks. Cargo ships sat idle, supply chains were disrupted, and businesses struggled to adapt to the new reality. Political agendas clashed with economic needs, leaving millions of workers and consumers caught in the crossfire. As factories ground to a halt and unemployment lines grew longer, the real-world impact of policy decisions became painfully clear. Families faced uncertainty, communities dependent on manufacturing were shaken, and the ripple effects spread far beyond the negotiating tables. In this chapter, we'll delve into the origins of the trade war, the key actions taken by both governments, and the far-reaching consequences that followed. We'll examine how a single dispute over steel transformed into a crisis with profound economic and social ramifications for millions. Through insights from leading economists, trade experts, and those directly affected, we'll explore what this conflict means for the future of global trade, and how ordinary citizens can influence the path forward in an increasingly interconnected world. To truly grasp the roots of the 2025 crisis, we need to look back at the deep and complex history of the US-Canada trade alliance. This partnership, forged over a century, has been a cornerstone of North American prosperity and industrial growth. The story of steel is at the heart of this relationship, shaping not only economies but also the lives of millions on both sides of the border. The US-Canada steel partnership began in the early 20th century, as both nations recognized the strategic importance of working together. Steel mills rose along the Great Lakes, and cross-border trade became a lifeline for communities from Ontario to Pennsylvania. Over time, this partnership evolved, weathering wars, recessions, and political shifts, yet always returning to a foundation of mutual benefit. For decades, the two countries operated as true partners in a North American industrial ecosystem. Factories and supply chains were designed to cross borders seamlessly, with raw materials, parts, and finished goods flowing back and forth. This integration created jobs, spurred innovation, and made both economies more resilient to global shocks. The steel industry in particular became a symbol of this cooperation. Generations of families found stable employment, and entire towns flourished thanks to the steady rhythm of cross-border commerce. The prosperity of cities like Hamilton and Detroit became intertwined, their fortunes rising and falling together. Canadian steel was vital to Detroit's automotive industry, creating a seamless cross-border supply chain. Automakers relied on just-in-time deliveries, and any disruption could ripple through the entire sector, affecting thousands of jobs and billions in economic activity. Landmark trade agreements like NAFTA in the 1990s and its successor, CUSMA, eliminated barriers and fostered a highly productive manufacturing zone. These agreements were not just about economics, they were about trust, cooperation, and a shared vision for the future of North America. By the 2020s, over 90% of Canadian steel exports went to the US, highlighting the deep dependency that had developed. This interdependence made the relationship both strong and, at times, vulnerable to political winds. When President Trump imposed tariffs in 2018, it sent shockwaves through the system. In Canada, the move was seen as a betrayal of a long-standing alliance, undermining decades of cooperation and trust. The tariffs ignored decades of shared prosperity. treating a trusted partner as an adversary. The sense of unity that had defined the relationship was suddenly in question, and the economic consequences were immediate and severe. This set the stage for a crisis that would test the limits of this historic friendship. Negotiators scrambled to find solutions, while workers and businesses faced uncertainty about the future. The tariffs struck at the heart of a meticulously built system, threatening not just profits, but the very fabric of communities that had depended on cross-border cooperation for generations. In 2025, Donald Trump's dramatic return to the White House sent shockwaves through global markets. Almost immediately, his administration reignited a wave of protectionist policies, signaling a sharp turn away from the trade agreements and international cooperation that had defined the previous years. The world watched as the United States, under Trump's leadership, began to redraw the economic map of North America. In March, a sweeping 25% tariff was slapped on Canadian steel imports. The announcement sent shockwaves through industries on both sides of the border, especially those deeply reliant on affordable Canadian steel. Manufacturers, construction companies, and automakers scrambled to assess the impact as costs began to rise overnight. By June, the situation escalated further. The tariff was doubled to a staggering 50%, a move that blindsided Canadian steel producers and left Detroit's automakers reeling. Factories that once hummed with activity now stood eerily silent, their machines idle and workers uncertain about the future. Orders for steel evaporated almost overnight. Production lines slowed to a crawl, and the financial markets responded with immediate alarm. Stock prices for major steel and auto companies tumbled, and investors braced for a prolonged downturn. Detroit's legendary automakers, already operating on razor-thin margins, faced a crisis. The soaring cost of steel forced them to halt production lines, leaving thousands of workers in limbo and threatening the city's fragile economic recovery. The just-in-time supply chain, once a model of efficiency, shattered under the pressure. With critical parts delayed or unavailable, factories across the Midwest and Canada shut their doors. Layoffs swept through communities, and the ripple effects were felt in every corner of the industry. The Canadian Steel Producers Association sounded the alarm, reporting a devastating 30% decline in production. Plants that had operated for generations now faced the prospect of permanent closure, and entire towns dependent on steel were plunged into uncertainty. In Detroit, the mood grew increasingly grim. Memories of the 2008 financial crisis resurfaced as news of layoffs, business closures, and economic hardship dominated the headlines. Families braced for another round of tough times, and the city's future hung in the balance. The tariff tsunami didn't just hit one nation, it devastated the industrial heartlands of both Canada and the United States. Once bustling factories became silent monuments to a vanished era of prosperity, and entire regions struggled to adapt to the new economic reality. Ironically, the policy meant to protect American industry ended up inflicting severe damage on the very workers and communities it was supposed to help. Protests erupted outside shuttered plants, as frustration and anger mounted across the Rust Belt. In the end, Detroit became a casualty in a self-inflicted economic war, its streets lined with closed businesses and for sale signs, a stark reminder of the unintended consequences of protectionism gone too far. Facing a crisis, Canadian PM Mark Carney launched a bold counter-strategy. Tightening tariff rate quotas, Canada built a defensive wall against foreign steel. Additional tariffs targeted steel from non-US countries, especially China. A new policy mandated Canadian steel for government projects, boosting domestic demand. Carney's plan aimed for economic sovereignty, resonating with Canadians feeling betrayed. The counterstrike was a declaration of independence and a blueprint for resilience. Detroit, tied to the auto industry, was hit hard by the steel tariffs. The big three automakers faced a supply chain crisis, halting production. Factory shutdowns led to widespread unemployment and economic strain. The search for alternative steel sources proved challenging and costly. Detroit's vulnerability to protectionist policies was starkly exposed. The tariffs, meant to protect, instead harmed American industry. Detroit's plight highlighted the complexities of global supply chains. Beyond economics, the steel tariff crisis had a human cost. In Canada, steel towns faced layoffs and uncertainty, disrupting community rhythms. In Detroit, plant shutdowns sent thousands home, affecting local economies. The social fabric frayed as families struggled with financial strain. Political risks grew as workers protested and demanded solutions. The crisis divided industrial workforces, fueling political polarization. In Canada, anti-American sentiment rose, complicating compromise. The trade war's human cost was measured in lost trust and increased division. The crisis strained cultural and social bonds between the two nations. In crisis, leaders' words can either inflame or guide. Canadian PM Carney's defiant rhetoric rallied national support. Catherine Cobden of the Canadian Steel Producers Association endorsed Carney's strategy. Trump's uncompromising stance deepened the economic divide. The crisis highlighted a disconnect between Canadian partnership and American nationalism. Carney focused on resilience, while Cobden fought for industry survival. Their statements painted a picture of a nation at a breaking point. The crisis underscored the need for a new path forward. The leaders' words captured the high stakes of the confrontation. Economists analyzed the steel crisis, warning of protectionism's dangers. Dr. Anjali Sharma noted the tariffs' collateral damage to integrated economies. Experts predicted a prolonged stalemate, forcing costly restructuring. Carney's domestic strategy was praised but not a complete solution. The crisis could lead to a permanent economic decoupling. Canadian businesses might avoid U.S. dependency, while U.S. companies source domestically. The integrated North American bloc risked dismantling. The crisis was a cautionary tale of political goals overriding economic logic. The outcome could reshape the continent's economic landscape. The 2025 steel crisis taught a lesson. Alliances can't be taken for granted. Canada learned the risks of over-reliance on a single partner. The U.S. faced the folly of waging trade wars against close allies. Citizens must engage and advocate for sensible economic policies. The crisis highlighted choices between cooperation and conflict. The future of U.S.-Canada relations depends on learning from this episode. The world watches as alliances and trade are redefined.